The ancient Cloister conspiracy, steeped in centuries of wisdom, are shattered by an unthinkable act, murder. Who among the brilliant minds of this hallowed institution could commit such a heinous crime? A soft-spoken wine salesman, Monig Egg, stumbles into a labyrinth of secrets where every whispered word hides a clue, and every face masks a motive. Listen closely, because the answers are hidden in plain sight. Can you solve the mystery before Mr. Egg does? The serene and scholarly atmosphere of the college, with its ivy-clad walls and the distant chime of bells marking the hour, was subtly disturbed by a ripple of scandalous whispers weaving through the air. Students shuffled past in lively conversations, their voices blending into a soft hum, while, at a nearby table, Radcott, always quick with his sharp wit, let out a mocking chuckle as he ridiculed Flathers, comparing the young man's self-righteous demeanor to that of a door-to-door sermon peddler. His companion, grinning mischievously, volleyed back with a teasing jab about Radcott's own arrogance, but the playful exchange darkened abruptly as the topic shifted to the shocking news gripping the college. Dr. Gray, the distinguished and once untouchable master of Pentecost, had met a grim and violent end, his life snuffed out by a crude weapon, a brick-filled Woolworth sock, leaving him sprawled lifeless outside his own home. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, and at a nearby table, Monig Egg, the picture of quiet composure, paused mid-sip, his sharp eyes narrowing as he subtly leaned closer to eavesdrop. With a polite cough to draw attention, he entered the conversation with the finesse of a practiced investigator, his questions cutting through the gossip with precision. Radcott's flippant demeanor gave way to unease as he recounted the ghastly details, and his companion's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, hinting at the master's peculiar behavior in the days leading up to his death. The trio's words painted a scene riddled with suspicions, secrets, and unanswered questions, the serene facade of academia cracking to reveal a sinister mystery lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to unravel at the hands of those willing to probe deeper. Monig Egg found himself walking alongside Radcott on the cobblestone paths leading toward Pentecost College. The towering spires of the historic institution loomed against a gray sky, their grandeur casting long shadows over the duo. Radcott, ever the cynic, couldn't resist a smirk as he glanced at Egg. "First time in Oxford, Mr. Egg? You've certainly chosen quite the day for your debut," he quipped, his voice tinged with dry amusement. Egg, his usual air of calm curiosity and tact, offered a polite smile. "Indeed, my first visit," he acknowledged, "though I must admit it's hardly the welcome I'd hoped for. Murder tends to unsettle even the most seasoned traveler." Radcott let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Unsettling? That's putting it mildly. The senior common room is in chaos, and the candidates for next week's exams? Positively trembling." His tone suggested amusement, but the tension in his words was unmistakable. Egg's gaze sharpened slightly. "Understandable, given the circumstances. But tell me," he pressed, "who might have had reason to harm the master? Was he perhaps controversial?" Radcott's smirk widened as he considered the question. "Controversial? That's one way to describe him. Dr. Gray had a particular talent for ruffling feathers, especially among the more devout. He delighted in dismantling notions of providence during his lectures." Egg's expression remained thoughtful as he mulled over the information. "A philosophical assassination, then, or something more personal?" he mused aloud. The imposing gates of Pentecost College rose before them, their intricate ironwork glinting faintly under the muted sunlight. A uniformed police officer stepped forward, his presence a stark reminder of the grim events that had unfolded. Names? Purpose of visit? the officer demanded curtly. Radcott, ever unbothered, offered a casual introduction. Radcott, student. This here is Mr. Monig Egg, a commercial traveler. He paused, his smirk returning. He's here on business, and possibly to solve a murder. Egg raised an eyebrow, the faintest glimmer of amusement crossing his face at the unconventional introduction. The officer, unfazed, gestured toward the college's cloisters. "The superintendent's in the cloisters," he said briskly. "But mind your step, the grass is still sacred, even during a murder investigation." With that, the gates creaked open, and the two men stepped forward into the heart of the investigation, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavier with every step. The sound of hurried footsteps and a faint murmur of voices filled the air. Out of nowhere, an elderly man, frail and hunched, shuffled into their path, narrowly avoiding a swerving car. Radcott reacted instantly, grabbing the man's arm to steady him. "Look out, Mr. Temple," he exclaimed. "We don't need another murder on our hands." The old man blinked, momentarily dazed, before his face twisted into a knowing frown. "Murder?" he muttered, his voice a mix of fear and resignation. "Oh, you mean the master? Yes, poor Dr. Gray. He's paid the price, hasn't he? Justice is slow but sure." Egg, ever attuned to nuance, stepped closer, his tone polite but probing. "Justice, you say? Do you mean to suggest you know something, sir?" Mr. Temple's eyes darted nervously, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with his hat. "Know something? No, nothing at all," he stammered, though his tone betrayed him. "Except the blood. Always disconcerting, isn't it? And yet, I wash my hands of it. Yes, I do." With that cryptic statement, he shuffled off, muttering incoherently under his breath, leaving Egg and Radcott standing in his wake. Radcott couldn't suppress a grin. "That's Mr. Temple for you," he said, his tone light despite the dark subject. "Claims responsibility for every murder in England. Convenient alibi, though, always in bed when the deed's done." Egg's expression didn't waver, his mind clearly racing. "Convenient indeed," he murmured. "But even the most improbable confessions often hold a grain of truth." The duo exchanged a glance, the weight of the mystery deepening as they prepared to delve further into the enigma surrounding Dr. Gray's untimely demise. As they tread the cool stone paths of the cloisters, their footsteps echo like whispers of a bygone era. Suddenly, Radcott stops, his brow furrowing as he points to a niche in the wall. Radcott. "There. That's where the murderer likely waited." Mr. Egg. "A tight fit for an ambush, wouldn't you say?" But ingenious nonetheless. A vantage point few would notice. Radcott. "Precisely. But a poor spot for fingerprints, I fear." They approach a sergeant kneeling with an electric torch, closely examining the ground. Sergeant, without looking up. "Sandbagged he was. No blood, no footprints, clean as a whistle, sir." Radcott, half joking. "I should have taken up burglary instead of rowing. I'd have made a fortune." Sergeant. "Try climbing up there then, sir. It's about 4 feet high." Radcott, with the agility of a cat, hoists himself up into the niche before anyone can protest. Sergeant. "Oi, you'll smudge any fingerprints." Radcott. "Relax, Sergeant. If you find mine, feel free to frame me for practice. Now, Egg, have you ever seen such a perfect hiding spot?" Mr. Egg. "Indeed. Though most burglars don't hold lectures on Aristotle before making their move." The conversation is interrupted by a bespectacled professor hurrying down the passage with an entourage of curious onlookers. Professor Staines. "Ah, Mr. Radcott, the superintendent's looking for you. Quite a curious affair, isn't it? The lady in question seemed restless." Radcott. "Restless enough to commit murder?" Professor Staines, aghast. Mr. Radcott, such impudence. Mr. Egg, chuckling. Well, we'll have to find her and ask, won't we? They part ways, and Radcott leads Mr. Egg to his rooms, where he produces a couple of bottles of beer. Radcott. Welcome to Oxford life. 1 murder, 1 madman, and 1 baffling lady. A fine initiation, wouldn't you say? Mr. Egg. Quite the welcome package. Now, about this mysterious lady. Radcott, sipping his beer. Old Mo will find her, or not. The Bodleian Library isn't exactly Fort Knox, you know. Borrow a gown, stroll in like you belong, and nobody bats an eye. Mr. Egg. Is that so? Care to prove it? Radcott, grinning mischievously. Don't tempt me, Egg. I might just do it. But first, let's solve a murder. The camera pans out, capturing the sunlit quads and timeless architecture of Oxford as the 2 unlikely sleuths toast to the adventure ahead. If you'd like, you can take my gown, toddle across to the Bodleian Library, march straight in past the showcases, and through the discreetly labeled Readers Only entrance into Duke Humphrey's library. Do whatever you like, short of stealing books or setting fire to the place, and if anyone dares question you, I'll personally order 6 dozen of whatever you fancy. Fair deal, isn't it? Mr. Egg, always one to seize an opportunity, accepted the offer with barely disguised enthusiasm. In no time, draped in a scholar's gown that lent him an air of credibility, he was climbing the grand staircase that led to England's most prestigious library. With a deep breath, he pushed open the glass door, stepping into the hallowed space of moldering leather and the quiet hum of studious activity. It was a temple of learning, and Mr. Egg, equal parts awe and apprehension, ventured forward. Just inside, he spotted Dr. Mo engaged in a conversation with the doorkeeper. Pretending to examine an ancient manuscript in a nearby showcase, Mr. Egg shamelessly eavesdropped on their rather loud exchange. I know the lady, Dr. M.O. She's been here several times recently, usually wearing an M.A. gown. I saw her this morning, but I can't recall when she left. I don't know her name, but she's clearly a senior member of the university. Hearing this, Mr. Egg didn't linger. A clever idea was already forming in his mind. He walked purposefully away, pushed open the Readers Only wicket, and ventured down the solemn medieval stretch of Duke Humphrey's library. At the farthest, dimmest bay, he found Mr. Temple, seated alone amidst a fortress of old, forbidding books. The man appeared utterly engrossed, scribbling furiously into a notebook beside a bulging attaché case. Leaning in with conspiratorial urgency, Mr. Egg whispered, "Excuse me, sir, but the police superintendent has asked me to inform you. They think they've found the lady. They urgently require your assistance to identify her." Mr. Temple looked up, startled. "The lady?" "Oh, yes, of course. Immediately, though it's rather inconvenient." He seemed torn between his scribblings and the urgency of the request. "They said it was particularly urgent, sir. No time to lose," Mr. Egg pressed, his tone steady but insistent. Flustered, Mr. Temple hesitated, then began shoving his papers into the already overstuffed attaché case, locking it hastily. "Allow me to carry that for you, sir," Mr. Egg offered, deftly seizing the case before shepherding Mr. Temple towards the porter's lodge. "There in the cloisters, sir," Mr. Egg lied smoothly, "but the superintendent requested you wait here for a moment." Depositing Mr. Temple and his attaché case under the watchful eye of the porter, Mr. Egg wasted no time. He dashed through the quadrangle, up a staircase, and into the room of a young scholar, Mr. Radcott. Barely catching his breath, he demanded, "What's an F book?" Radcott, surprised, raised an eyebrow. "An F book? It's a book deemed, indelicate, catalogued under the Greek letter phi." "Why?" "Well," Mr. Egg began, his words tumbling out in a rush, "it occurred to me how simple it would be for someone to walk into the Bodleian, disguise themselves in a quiet corner of Duke Humphreys, slip out, commit a murder, and return unnoticed. Just a change of clothes and an M.A. gown would suffice. And today of all days, Mr. Temple asked for an F book. Isn't that peculiar? He's a former fellow of the college. He'd know which route Dr. Greby would take after his lecture. He'd know about the niche in the wall, too. And that attaché case of his, it's large enough to hold a lady's hat and skirt. Not to mention the top coat he's wearing on such a hot day, perfect for concealing the upper portion of a disguise. Doesn't it all seem a little too convenient?" Radcott stared, open-mouthed. "Temple? You're mad. He's always confessing to crimes he didn't commit. You can't possibly think—" "There's an old fable," Mr. Egg interrupted, "about the boy who cried wolf so often that no one believed him when the real wolf came. As the salesman's handbook says, discretion plays a major part in making up the salesman's art, for truths that no one can believe are calculated to deceive. I took the liberty of asking myself a few questions, and now, well, I've got him waiting outside, with his case, under the porter's watchful eye. Just in case." Radcott blinked, processing the cascade of logic. "That's actually quite clever." "Well," Mr. Egg said modestly, "it's all in a day's work for a commercial traveler. Solving mysteries is just another way to close a sale. Now, here's the thing. The guy we're talking about? Far from the typical detective. He's not some high-flying cop or a suave private eye. Nope, he's a wine salesman. Yeah, you heard that right. Imagine a guy who spends his days selling wine, but somehow ends up solving murders. It sounds like something out of a wild dream, right? But that's what makes the golden age of detective fiction so fantastic. These aren't your usual detectives. Mrs. Kaggs, remember her? A cleaner by day, a mystery solver by night. Then there's Hercule Poirot, the consulting detective, and Sherlock Holmes, who might as well have been born with a magnifying glass in his hand. But this guy, he's just selling wine. Yet somehow, he cracks these mind-boggling cases. The stories from Monty Egg's world are fun, quirky, and just weirdly charming. They were published in The Passing Show and later collected in Hangman's Holiday and in The Teeth of the Evidence. And what's wild is they often hinge on the tiniest, almost laughable details, things that seem utterly insignificant until they become the key to solving the whole case. And this is where the real magic happens. Monty uses these aphorisms from his salesman's handbook to crack every case. I mean, picture this: solving murders with sales tips. Doesn't make sense, right? But somehow it does. It's all about questioning the obvious, doubting the things that seem too simple, and letting the truth unfold from there. It's genius in its own way. Now, don't get me wrong. Not all of Monty Egg's stories hit the same literary high notes. Some, like Dirt Cheap and A Shot at Gold, rely a little too much on coincidences, and the themes might not resonate as well with modern readers. But hey, that's part of the charm. These stories are packed with cultural references, a snapshot of 1930s society. It's like stepping into a time capsule of Oxford, with all its quirks and eccentricities. Sure, maybe things aren't quite the same in Oxford anymore, but reading these stories gives you a glimpse of a world that's long gone. And speaking of snapshots, Murder at Pentecost, first published in 1933, is another one of those wild Monty Egg tales. It's got everything: the wine merchant, the mysterious murders, the absurdity of it all. Monty works for Plummet and Rose, these wine merchants, but somehow finds himself tangled up in crime and mystery. And the whole thing was written for The Passing Show, a UK weekly that was a lifeline for writers back in the day. Kind of like how we have Kindle and KDP now, though, let's be honest. The whole self-publishing world today is a bit of a swamp. But in the 1930s, that was where writers lived and thrived. And here's the kicker. It's raining outside, it's dark, the lights have been on all day, and I'm just about done in after the gym. But Monty Egg, he'd be all about cracking a case, rain or shine. You gotta love the guy's hustle. So, let's dive in. Murder at Pentecost, the mystery that never lets up. So, here's the deal. Dr. Greby, the master of Pentecost, is found dead, and the way he meets his end is straight out of a suspense thriller. A brick bat wrapped up in a sock near his head. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. I remember seeing something similar in that movie, The Boston Boys, you know, with Ray Winston. Violent young men using a pool ball wrapped in a sock as a weapon. Well, in this case it's a brick bat, and trust me, it works just as well. But why? What's the story behind this violent end? The answer's hidden in a twisted web of academic rivalry. Sounds like something straight out of a Mrs. Clee story, doesn't it? We're talking about egos, old grudges, and intellectual one-upmanship. In this case, it's not a French dictionary like in Mrs. Claus' tale, but a far deeper academic clash. What could possibly push someone to murder over something as seemingly trivial as a debate on Plato's Enclitics? That's what we're about to find out. And what really makes this story pop is the way it dives into Oxford's quirky customs. I mean, if you know anything about Oxford, you know it's got that oddball mix of intellect and madness. And here's where it gets even juicier, the character of Mr. Temple. This guy is both an intellectual and a madman. A thin line separates the two, right? But the real question is, does that line even exist? The smarter you get, the weirder you become. Or maybe it's the other way around? Maybe eccentricity comes hand in hand with knowledge. Think about it. These days, we're all forced to specialize. First, you're a physicist. Then, you narrow it down to quantum physics. And before you know it, you're deep into Quigg's bonds. Yes, I just made that up. Don't worry, they'll discover them soon enough. The point is, you're so immersed in a tiny little field, you forget how to talk about anything else. You end up talking to people about Quigg's bonds, and guess what? You become eccentric. Your mind's so consumed by a minuscule area of knowledge that you start losing touch with the rest of the world. And trust me, that's when you cross over from intellectual to eccentric genius. It's a slippery slope. So back to Doctor. Greby's murder. Was Mr. Temple crazy? Or was this all part of a meticulously planned revenge scheme? A pre-planned act years in the making, aimed at settling some ancient academic score? Was he nursing a grudge over Plato's Enclitics? Seriously, the guy was a Greek scholar, so this whole academic betrayal could have been brewing for years. It makes you wonder, was this murder just a personal vendetta, or was it the result of years of building frustration over Greek philosophy? And honestly, I'm sitting here wondering if Temple had this whole thing plotted out long before the murder. Did he know exactly how to make his move? How to strike at the heart of his rival's work, like a slow burn of revenge? It's a brilliant plan, but I can't quite figure out if it's genius or madness. But what I do know is that this story is a fascinating mix of intellect and madness. And that's exactly what keeps me hooked. Now, speaking of being hooked, Ruby, my dog, is staring at me right now, probably wondering why I'm not paying attention to her. She's shaking her head like, "Hurry up with this, I want my walk." I get it, Ruby, I do. But once I finish telling you this story, we're out of here. Trust me, we'll hit the pavement and get moving. But first, let's dive deeper into this mystery. Did Mr. Temple really plan it all? Or was he just another man pushed over the edge by the madness of intellectual rivalry? Imagine this. Years and years ago, or maybe just months, someone thought, I'm going to pretend to be absolutely out of my mind. I'll claim I've murdered someone in Lincoln week after week until everyone believes I'm a complete lunatic. And then, when the time's right, I'll strike. I'll finally get my revenge and no one will ever suspect it's me. To top it off, I'll dress up as a woman, because why not add a little flair to the madness? It's bizarre, right? A masterstroke of pretending to be insane to cover up a long-planned revenge. The thing is, though, this whole plot, it wasn't just about chaos, it was entertainment. It's like one of those stories that's so wild it could only exist in a novel, like something out of Graham Greene's playbook. He'd probably call it entertainment, too. But does it have any real merit? Well, here's the thing. It does. First off, the writing. It's sharp, technical, and just incredibly well crafted. Then there's the character development. Sure, the characters might seem a little cartoonish on the surface, but when you look closer, they're beautifully drawn, full of depth and strange, unpredictable quirks. But what really makes this story stand out is the snapshot it provides of a very specific world, the high-class British academic society of the early 20th century. It's a fascinating look into the intellectual circles of Oxford and Cambridge, a world where everything's about high tables, quadrangles, and the unspoken rules of decorum. Imagine being so erudite, intellectual, that all you care about is the exact protocol of walking on the quadrangle at Oxford. It's quirky, eccentric, and honestly mind-blowing when you start to look at it from the inside. It's like stepping into a different universe, where everyone's so specialized and eccentric, they've forgotten what it's like to just live. That's the world we're diving into here, and it's one that's as strange and captivating as the murder mystery itself. All right, so let's take a moment to really break this down. Imagine living in a world where the most exciting things happen in the senior common room of some exclusive academic society, where everything revolves around the unspoken rules. Who gets to sit at the high table when it's acceptable to step on the quadrangle, and which eccentric professor's going to give you the weirdest, most obscure lecture you've ever heard. It's like a whole different universe, right? One that's so erudite, intellectually specialized, that the people who live there are so obsessed with their little corner of knowledge that they forget what it's like to just live. Now, here's the kicker. We could dive deep into this world, become absolute experts on it, and churn out story after story about this curious academic bubble. It's endless material, full of weird customs and delightful chaos. And honestly, that's what makes this whole thing so irresistibly fascinating. We're not just talking about a few quirky professors. We're talking about an entire world, a whole society built around this strange academic ritualism, where every rule is a form of intellectual rebellion. But more than that, it's also about merit, or perhaps the illusion of merit. So here's where the story really takes a turn. We've got this traveling wine salesman, nothing special, right? But somehow, this ordinary guy, with absolutely no qualifications to be solving crimes, overhears a little something that changes the whole game. And bam, just like that, he's piecing together a murder mystery the police can't crack. You'd think it would make sense, that the whole thing is neatly tied up in some big, grand motive. But it's not. The murder? Well, it's for some obscure, barely understandable reason. Honestly, you're left wondering, did I miss something? Was there a motive, or did the whole thing just happen in the weirdest possible way? It doesn't matter, because in the end, it's fun. It's light, it's refreshing, and it makes you laugh. And honestly, that's what we need sometimes. This crazy world of ours can be too much, and sometimes all you want is a little bit of relief, a little break from the seriousness, right? So here we are with a story that doesn't take itself too seriously, and that's what makes it so enjoyable. But let's talk about why this story stands out. First, let's start with the writing. We're not just looking at a simple narrative here. The writing is sharp, precise, and deliberate. Every word serves a purpose. There's no fluff, it's all substance. Then there's the characters. At first, they might seem cartoonish, but when you look closely, they're beautifully drawn, full of quirks, depth, and contradictions. There's something about them that's so captivating. They're strange, unpredictable, and utterly unforgettable. You don't just read about these people, you start to feel their world, their absurdities, their motivations. But perhaps the most striking thing of all is how this story serves as a snapshot of a very specific time, the early 20th century British academic world. A world where intellectualism wasn't just a way of life, it was an obsession, a lifestyle that consumed people entirely. The whole thing feels like a bizarre time capsule, offering a peek behind the curtain of a society that's now almost completely gone. A society where everything from walking across the quadrangle at Oxford to the placement of a book on a shelf was a sign of status, knowledge, and power. It's eccentricity at its finest, and trust me, it's more fascinating than it sounds. Now, back to the plot. The wine salesman. I mean, who would have thought, right? A simple man, going about his business, and suddenly he finds himself in the middle of a murder investigation. And not just any murder, but one that's wrapped in mystery, riddled with oddities, and is connected to some long-forgotten academic feud that, honestly, you're not even sure makes sense. It's a classic case of you don't need to understand the why to enjoy the how. Sometimes the mystery isn't even the point, it's the journey, the wild, unpredictable ride that comes with it. And you know what? That's exactly what this story is. A fun, thrilling ride. You get wrapped up in the strange world of academia, the quirky characters, and before you know it, you're laughing at how absurd it all is. Sometimes that's all we need. A bit of lightheartedness to lift us up when everything feels too heavy. And, speaking of lifting the mood, let's talk about what's coming up. I've got some bigger stories planned, especially with Christmas around the corner. Imagine a tale so rich, so intricate, that it'll leave you hooked from the first line to the last. It's going to be huge, and I think you're going to love it. But here's the thing. As much as I've loved sharing these detective stories with you, I've got a question for you. Should I bring back some of the American detective stories? I've been thinking about it lately. I know I've been a little shy about featuring them, but honestly, in trying to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one. Some of those hard-boiled detective tales, they're personal favorites of mine, even though I'm not exactly American. Still, the grit, the action, the tension, there's something uniquely thrilling about them. I once did a whole bunch of old American detective stories for a podcast, and I even tried doing accents for laughs. It was hilarious, honestly. Maybe I'll compile them into a video just for fun. Who knows? But for now, I hope you're doing well. I'm praying this rain lets up soon so I can finally take Ruby out. She's not going to be happy if I don't. Trust me, she'll be ready to murder me, no pun intended, of course. So, yeah, stick around for more, share the love, and keep the word going about these detectives. There's so much more to come. Stay tuned. Things are just getting started.